Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 30th chapter in the book of Job. We made it all the way up to the first 15 verses. We're going to cover this one 16 all the way home to 31. And the 30th chapter consists of 5 complaints of Job. He bemoans of having no respect in the first 15 verses, so the first of the 5 covers a little before the midway point of the chapter. The final 4 are the ones we're going to be reviewing today. Job complains about having no blessing, verses 16 through 23. He complains about having no help, verses 24-25. He complains about having no future, verses 26 through 28. And he complains about having no ministry, verses 29 and 31. And Job's the acuteness and the intensity of the sense is amplified by the fact that Job once had all these things. So the 29th chapter and the 29th chapter consists of Job looking back with fond nostalgia to a life that once was. His best days were ahead of him. And then in the 30th chapter, he transitions into his predicament. The way we're going to do this review is by reviewing the 4 final things in that list of 5 of his complaints and the sense of what he had. So the 29th chapter is the mountaintop experience. The 30th is the valley experience. The Christian life consists of highs and lows. And Job had there are 2 types of faith we must have in order for our faith to be balanced, complete, and whole. That is the foul weather faith and the fair weather faith. A lot of people, if riches increase, set not your heart upon them, because these can become a substitute replacement for God when you look to it as your ultimate source of satisfaction and security, and you make sacrifices and think fondly on these. So the danger, if you can have wealth and have faith, that's all well and good. Job had that. He had been rewarded in proportion to his righteousness, but something was missing, and that was the cultivation of the fair weather faith. So Satan comes along one day in the heavenly throne room. Yahweh points with pride and delight to his servant Job. There is none like him on the earth. He is perfect and upright and eschews evil. All that, and Satan accuses Yahweh of being a God unworthy of worship, implying that he had to pay Job to worship him. And if he took all the blessings and the prosperity away from him, he would curse him to his face. And Yahweh ultimately consents to the challenge. And the book of Job, after the first 2 chapters, consist of dialogues, which are really more exchanges of monologues between Job and 3 comforters. We meet a 4th one in the 32nd chapter. But the 26th through 31st chapter are Job's 9th and final speech. This is his longest chunk, and what happens between his 3 comforters so far is a sustained stalemate. What they have between them is an immovable object meeting an irresistible force. So the first complaint we're going to read today is the no blessing, and he once was blessed. He speaks of these in the 2nd through 6th verse of the 29th chapter. He speaks of having the protection, the light, the guidance, the friendship, the intimacy of Elohim. When El Shaddai was still with me, when my children were around me. Children and the power and presence, but what's interesting there in the 5th verse is was still. This is past tense. This is a life that no longer was. Job can only fondly look back and wish. He could only wish his life would be what it once was, but he has the sense that his best days are ahead of him. He makes this more plain in the 30th chapter. The second complaint we read of is that he feels bereft of any help. And the irony and tragedy is that Job always lent a helping hand to those who were in need. When he was strong, he always uplifted the weak. So now that he found himself weak, he is perplexed and bewildered to find that no men who, if he was in their shoes, he would certainly help them out. But because I rescued the poor who cried out, and the fatherless who had no helper. Orphans, poor, the vulnerable, the exploitable, the oppressed, the forgotten, the least, the lost, the lowly, the last. Those who are without helpers, he was there to lend a helping hand to those who were bereft of resources. Poor and orphans are not an easy life, so they do need help, and Job was there to help them. The blessing of the perishing one would come upon me, and I made the widow's heart sing for joy. Widow was another vulnerable member of society, especially female widows, because in the ancient world, being married was your only possible means of of surviving or sustaining. So you didn't have professional opportunities if your husband died. But to bring joy to widows whose life consists of mourning, their husband is bereaved, to make them able to sing joy, that is a blessing of blessings. So Job was blessed by Elohim, and he spread the blessings to all those around him. Verse 15, I was eyes to the blind, and I was feet to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and I investigated the case which I did not know. He served as eyes to the blind and feet to the lame, those who were weak. He gave them the strength to walk, metaphorically, and the sight to see, metaphorically. And literally, we can just picture Job escorting a blind man across the road as a matter of course. But also father to the poor. This doesn't mean that he raised them. It just means he looked after them. He was their protector, if not their provider. So the impartiality is the key of equitable jurisprudence. So Job did exercise judgment at the city gates, and he exercised his authority responsibly. He investigated the case, which wouldn't concern a less righteous judge, because there was no money in protecting the poor, but there was money in protecting the rich. The practice of bribes corrupts and turns a justice system into a system of injustice. The next complaint we read of is he bemoans himself having no future, and he speaks this in verse 18. Then I thought I would die in my nest and increase my days as the sand. Job had no reason or expectation, no reason to expect that his life would not continue its march forward of just greater reward, greater influence, all these things. And, he does get his fortunes and his children's restored twofold in the end, but at this time, Job at this point is convinced that the only thing left for him to do is die. He is at the severity of the extreme of pain which he can withhandle, and he's not ready to commit suicide, but he does curse the day he was born and wish that he had never been born. So severe was his pain. So he had a revolutionary reversal of fortunes which shattered this former delusion. Although he had no reason to expect it to be a delusion. And the fifth and final complaint we're going to read of in the passage we covered today is having no ministry. Job, he had the urge to minister to others, and ministry translates as service or help. To me they listened, and they waited, and kept silent at my counsel. After my words they did not speak again, and my speech settled on them. And they waited for me like rain, for they opened their mouth wide as for the latter rain. So when Job spoke, he commanded attention. He spoke with authority, and whoever you were, whether you were a prince, whether you were a pauper, whether you were high, whether you were low, you listened, because his words had great gravity. They were treated with respect. So when Job spoke, that was the moment when you listened. And there was no resisting his arguments, and he had the wisdom, but he didn't have the dignity or the station anymore. So people once looked to him, and his words was respected. Where was his respect now? This is the nature and substance of his complaint. And, he longed to bring blessings, open their mouth wide as the latter rain, that speaks of bestowing blessings on people. That is another element and aspect of ministry. We're going to take this from the 16th verse in the 30th chapter. Remember, in the first 15 verses, he bemoans of his lack of respect. We'll just briefly summarize it. Job was, when he was on top, he was always there for those who were on low. Now that he was on bottom, he couldn't understand why no one would look at him or help him or anything else, because he had always been there for them. And now that he was one of them, where was the people he once was to look out for him? Verse 16, and now my life pours itself out. Days of affliction seize me. Job is in excruciating agony and pain. He is covered from head to toe with painful, ugly skin boils. And he also speaks of his physical symptoms. He's emaciated. His breath stinks. He's skin and bones. He's not doing too well physically. So he has the sense that the only thing left for him to do is to just die, because life is not worth living when you are in constant and severe pain. And on top of that, to add insult to injury, he had lost all his children, he had lost all his livestock, he had lost all his property, he had lost all his prestige. The only thing left for him to do, as he could see it at this point, was for Yahweh, who had afflicted him, he insisted, to just end his life, put him out of his misery. Days of affliction, this alternately translates affliction as depression, and depression is when the sad and dejected emotions control you. You want to be in control of your emotions, but just this spirit of sadness controls and dominates those who are depressed. Depression is a more prolonged sadness. Sadness comes to us all, but if you are depressed, and depression is on the rise in our modern world, because we have our secular humanism teaches us that we are purposeless creatures who are here to consume and enjoy. So that ultimately produces a lot more depression when we are deracinated from our theological mores. But so a lot of these depression cases are the result of the realm of Satan and demons. Now, every case of depression can be explained scientifically, and most of them consist of organic problems. But a lot of it, and it's not necessarily one or the other. It can be explained scientifically, and it can also be explained theologically. My bones have been pierced in me at night, and my gnawings never lie down. He was emaciated, he was famished. He had been sitting in ash and burlap, and pouring dust over his head, and he sat there for 7 days in prolonged silence. So we don't have a time frame of where the 30th chapter is in reference to the 30th. We don't know if this is one continuing unending dialogue, or these are spaced apart over the course of days, whether they have to take time to map out in their head what it is that they're going to say. But in any case, Job is not doing physically well, he's not doing emotionally well, he's not spiritually well. His faith and his integrity are still there, but he feels abandoned and forsaken by the Yahweh, who he can't understand, because he had not abandoned him, he had not forsaken him, even in all, and he didn't care about the restoration of his property. All he cared about was his own vindication. That's how righteous Job was. And gnawing is just the hunger pangs, the sharp pains that come if you've ever fasted. You get gnawings. By great exertion is my garment changed. It girds me as the collar of my throat. The garment, this would have been a tight neck. So a garment was just what the ancients wore. It was usually a single piece of clothing that went underneath, the exterior clothing. But he's speaking of the neck collar at this point. So the collar of my coat, he feels that he is being choked because the neck collar guards the throat. So he's speaking of being asphyxiated. Just his present predicament is comparable and relatable to the experience of being bereft of even breath. That's how much his life is on the line at this point. Throwing me into the mud, and I have become like dust and ashes. Dust and ashes, Job began his experience, his post, after all these losses came and all this calamity came in the twinkle of an eye. He sat in ashes, repenting with sackcloth and burlap, the ritual clothes. But dust and ashes, we read that word again in the 42nd chapter, when Job finally gets his long requested audience with Yahweh. He speaks of his nothingness in the 6th chapter, and he repents in dust and ashes in the 42nd chapter. And this also reminds us the identical terms emerge in Genesis 18:27. Abraham is in the context of petitioning that Yahweh not destroy the city of Sodom if there were enough innocent people left in it. But he says, who am I to question? I am but dust and ashes. Abraham approaches him from the proper foundation of his own nothingness. And we have to have a sense of our own nothingness. But Job is being, now humility and humiliation are two different things, although they do share much in common. They both derive from the same Latin etymological root of humus, to be the ground. So a humble person will be internally grounded and down to earth, whereas a stubborn mule will require humiliation. Job already had humility, but he was being humiliated, and he did not deserve that. I cry out to you, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you understand me. In the 26th chapter, Job, this was what launches his ninth and final stretch of speeches. He's addressing Bildad the Shuhite, so the you, but then in the 27th, the you is plural, and then in the 28th, it's may or may not have been Job speaking. It may have been the author of Job, but he gets more personal in the 30th chapter. It's you, so the you is capitalized. That is El Shaddai, Yahweh on high, the Almighty, the great, all-seeing, all-knowing eye in the sky. And Job is praying persistently, fervently, and frequently, but he can't catch his attention. He's accusing Yahweh of ignoring him. And prayer is not so simple as to get an immediate response every time. But he has some sense of frustration in the frequency and fervency of his prayers receiving no answer. And to say that that Yahweh doesn't understand me. Now, none of us can understand him, but Yahweh knows us better than we could possibly know ourselves. He is an omniscient being. He knows the hairs on our head and so much more. You have become cruel to me. With the power of your hand, you opposed me. He's accusing Yahweh of abusing his omnipotence. He had this personal vendetta, this unjust compulsion to afflict Job, who, having done nothing to deserve the devastation and calamity that was sent his way. So he feels judged, but he wants to know what the crime was. So it would be the equivalent of you being imprisoned without knowing what it is that you are there for. Job wants to know these, and he's accusing him of cruelty, that he is capricious in his wrath, inflicting it indiscriminately on those who deserve it not. And the book of Job belongs in the category in the genre of theodicy. This genre attempts to explore and explain the great question of the relationship of the righteous to suffering. Why do good things happen? Why do bad things happen to good people? And in another chapter, Job asks it, why do good things happen to bad people? Same side, different side of the same coin. But he feels that, he had the friendship. Remember, we read that word in the 4th verse of the 29th chapter, but now he's opposed. So Yahweh is his enemy, and he can't understand why Yahweh is treating him like an enemy, as he never declared war on him. So he cannot understand why this preemptive strike, this unmerited punishment and calamity, the punishment was made more severe by the fact that there was no crime that he was aware of. And even though Job did not suffer because he sinned, he did sin in his suffering. We caught a glimpse of the self-righteousness with, for example, in verse 20, you understand me. I stand... So he's saying that he has more insight into Yahweh's character than the inverse, the one who made him. He has more insight into the mind and the machinations of the mind of the Creator than his Creator does of him. So he says, a lot of people say regrettable things in passionate circumstances, and Job's are spaced out few and far in between. Much of what he says is right, and he has every right and reason to complain and protest, but occasionally he does. The sin of self-righteousness is subtle, not only in Job's cases, but in our own. You lift me up to the wind, making me to ride it, and you melt me in a storm. Wind, storm, the natural elements, these would have been seen, especially by the ancients, as providential instruments of judgment, and the wind, the wind that had crushed the physical structure, how his eldest son's home, where all his children were gathered there to eat at his home, the wind collapsed the structure, and the storms would have been, divine judgments. We find Jonah in one, for instance. But what's interesting also is that I think in the 38th chapter, he descends in a whirlwind. So that wind is once more, he descends just as he is described here, condescends and descends. For I have known you, that you bring me to death, in the house appointed for all living. Death is the inescapable reality. You can fight it. You can change the channel when it comes up in conversation, but we all have to die. Man is the only creature in the animal kingdom who has a sense of his destiny after death. And the house appointed for all the living. This is so death is not the end. It is not extinction. It is not annihilation. There is such a thing as life after death, and the life after death is in fact more expansive than the life as we know it now. We are mortal, but our souls are immortal, and those who make it to the land of living, we know this by the revelation of the new covenant, they will be resurrected. But those who don't make it, those who die in their sins and die the second death, they will be disembodied with their immortal soul to linger in the outer darkness of solitude for an eternity. No one there to comfort them, no one there to... So he speaks of... Job does have an inconsistent theology pertaining to the afterlife. He seems to expect Sheol and have no hope beyond the grave, but at other points he doesn't speak with a consistently uniform voice. He does express faith in the Redeemer who had not yet been born, that he would stand up on the earth and judge him innocent in the 19th chapter and a few other places. The mediator, there are messianic allusions in the book of Job. Yet does not one in a heap of ruins stretch out for his hands, or in calamity cry out for help? Job's experience clearly validates the premise of his suggestion. He was looking for help. He was crying out for help, praying frequently, fervently, just struggling to make sense of it. He wanted help because he needed help. And all this calamity, this unmerited, devastating, without precedent or parallel in the human experience, as far as, there's literally been none of us who quite went through what Job went through. But he was living in a heap of ruins. He was repenting in the dust and ashes. His home had been, at least one of his homes had collapsed. His livestock, his cattle were gone. He had fruitless fields, childless homes, just a wife left. So his life was shattered and in ruins, but it is never so ruined as to be beyond redemption. And Job eventually does receive a twofold restoration of what he once had, as measured in children and livestock and cattle. Did I not weep for him who was in trouble? Was my soul not grieved for the poor? So this, we actually lost track. So this is the third complaint. He's complaining about having no help. So he had been there to help those who were weak when he was strong. He always lent a helping hand to those who were bereft of their own resources, incompetent to protect themselves in court of law. They had a friend like Job. But now the revolutionary reversal of his quality of life and its life itself had sent that, and also in a 180-degree direction. So even though Job had always been there to help the weak, and now that he was weak, there was no strong to protect him, and he couldn't quite fathom it because he had always been there. If their shoes are reversed, he would certainly lend a helping hand. So he can't understand why certain people weren't as righteous as him. When I looked for good, then evil came to me, and when I waited for light, darkness came. This is the fourth complaint. He's lamenting about having no future. So the darkness, that is analogous with death in this context. It's also metaphorical for sin, ignorance, doubt, despair. Satan rules the kingdom of darkness. But to look for good and then evil be... Job thought no harm, he inflicted no harm, and he did no harm. But so for all this great harm to come to him, he couldn't fathom the righteousness of the sovereign deity, who he personally blamed for inflicting this evil upon him. And he did allow it, but it was Satan who had inflicted the evil. So he was waiting for light. Earlier he says that he would die in my nest, verse 18, 29th chapter. So he's expecting light to keep going, but then suddenly the darkness comes in the twinkle of an eye, and it is a darkness that is not easily extinguished. Much of Job is a struggle to make sense of it, and that is why James exalts Job as a model of endurance in James 5:11. My inward parts boiled and did not rest. Days of affliction went before me. He's speaking of internal pains. The pain is also emotional and subterranean, but it's also physical. So his inward point, every part of Job's body was not doing well. He was emaciated. His breath stank. He was skin and bones poking through the clothes, and he had terrible, ugly, painful skin boils from head to toe all over himself. So we have no reason to doubt that his inward parts were physically collapsing. They were not what they once were. There are definite health consequences to Job's when Satan inflicts you with sickness. Not all sickness is Satan-induced, but he is the author of disease and death and everything else. But days of affliction, we read that earlier in the 16th verse, that phrase, and we're not familiar with it being translated as depression in this one, so these may be the same. But I think it means more what it means. Affliction is just pain and injury. So those are his days now. I went about blackened, but not by the sun. I stood up in the assembly. I cried for help. To be blackened in skin is what he's referring to. Now, this would have been possible because the Hebrews were not a white people, or the Edomites even. They were Semitic people, so the potentiality for them to... But it would have been considered a sign of wealth, and whatever is rich is attractive in any generation. So if you can afford protection from the sun, if you don't have to or earn your own bread by the sweat of your own toil, then that looks. But Job's not talking about the blackened, and this is how the Shunammite bride of Solomon's is described in Song of Solomon. She was not African, as has been composed, but she was worked in the field, so she was black from the sun. But Job's not talking about the sun. He's talking about being blackened by the dirt. All the debris of all the explosion, all the collateral damage is physically accumulating and just making his skin black. So that just shows where he is. And he's in the assembly, the place where he once wielded and exercised influence and prominence, and he had always been there to lend a helping hand to others, but his cries for help go unheeded. I became a brother of jackals and a companion of ostriches. Jackals specifically are likened by the ancients to symbols of devastation and ruin. Once town becomes a ghost town, then jackals dwell in there. So a den of jackals would have been a place of decline and devastation and ruin. This is where the jackals dwell. But so he is closely connected to them by the virtue of his experience in being in ruin. He can feel the jackals literally all around him. My skin became black upon me, and my bones burned with heat. Blackness would have been not exactly a curse, but it wouldn't have been considered very attractive, because if you were rich, you could afford to not be so suntanned by the being outside and exposed to the sun all day. You would have the luxury and the comfort to dwell protected and shielded from that stuff. But Job's bones are literally burning with heat, so not only are his bones sticking out of his skin, they're also burning with heat. Job is not a well man. These are very real and present and pressing physical symptoms. So my lyre becomes mourning, and my flute the sound of weeping. As much as it is easy to say to always have a song on the tip of your tongue, a song of praise, even when you are in prison, even when you are in the depths of despair, whether you are at the low valley experience that we spoke of earlier, sometimes the only thing you can sing is voices of mourning and voices of weeping, and there's nothing wrong with being honest. So if you are in depth in despair and you struggle with doubt, it's not unrighteous for you to express those doubts out loud, because the doubt expressed can lead to faith and enhance and supplement and complete. But if you harbor unbelief in your heart, and a doubting mind struggles to believe, an unbelieving mind refuses to believe. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.